My grandfather was always somewhat of an unpleasant person. It might not be the most polite thing to say about a close family member, but I think most people who knew him, including him, would likely agree. He was a stoic man, rarely showing emotion, with a temper as short as the thinning gray hair on his head. He always had a scowl on his face, his brows furrowed in a constant sneer, exuding that stay-off-my-lawn attitude that only a proud, old-school boomer could manage to pull off. I remember one summer when my family visited him and my grandmother. He scolded my older sister for gaining a little weight, which made her cry and escalated into a massive family drama that was never really resolved. In sharp contrast, my grandmother was the sweetest, most loving person I've ever known. So when she passed away a few years ago, it hit our family hard. Her funeral was a somber event, with my grandfather staying distant throughout, barely saying a word in her memory. The rest of us gave eulogies and tried to honor her, but Grandpa seemed indifferent, almost detached. Once the ceremony ended and most of the guests had left the church, I found myself alone in the pews. Grandpa was sitting at the front, and while I didn't really want to engage with him, I felt like I should. "Hey, Grandpa. I'm really sorry for your loss," I said, quietly. He turned to me, a look of resentment on his face, before his expression softened slightly. "Thanks, buddy, it's a tough day for all of us," he muttered, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief and swallowing. For a moment, I saw him in a way I never had before, vulnerable, broken, struggling with the loss. It was a side of him I hadn't expected to see, and despite our strained relationship, I felt an overwhelming urge to offer him some comfort. Grandpa got up from his seat and walked over to the casket. He placed a hand on it, speaking softly under his breath, "Don't worry, darling, I'm right behind you." We spoke a little more, and I decided that he could use some company for the evening. Although he had always been hard to warm up to, he was still family. There was also something about him that intrigued me, something beyond the cold, gruff exterior. No one should have to mourn alone, so I offered to stay and have dinner with him. After the funeral, I went to the store, picking up steaks, golden potatoes, and asparagus. I thought cooking him a decent meal might be the least I could do given the circumstances. When I arrived at my grandparents' house, it was in much worse shape than I remembered. The yard was overgrown, and the house itself seemed tired, worn down by time. It had been over a decade since I had visited, and while it was still vaguely familiar, the state of disrepair made it feel foreign. Grandpa greeted me at the door, and we headed out to the backyard where he fired up the grill. It felt a little awkward at first, but after a couple of beers, we began to open up more. I told him about my life, my fiancée, and my work, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We chatted for a while, but I know that's not what most people are here for. After all, this is a horror story, so I'll get to the point. Grandpa had worked in prison rehabilitation his entire career. He started as a guard when he was just 18 and eventually became the warden, a position he held until his retirement a few years ago. I asked him which prison he worked at, but he avoided answering the question. "Must have been a tough job, huh?" I asked casually, and he paused, considering the question before taking a swig from his beer. "You get used to it, like anything, but it wouldn't be fair to call it easy. Always had to stay on your toes, expecting something to go wrong at any moment. You never really know what to expect," he explained. Grandpa went on to tell me a few stories from his long career in the prison system, though he seemed almost eager to share them, perhaps because he didn't have anyone else to talk to. He had always been a bit of a loner, and with my grandmother gone, I could sense that he had no one left to confide in. It made me feel a little bad for him. We continued eating and talking about his experiences working in corrections, about the mundane interactions with inmates and his colleagues. But something about his tone seemed off. There was a heaviness in his words, as if there was something deeper, darker that he was holding back. When I arrived at my grandparents' house, it was in much worse shape than I remembered. The yard was overgrown, and the house itself seemed tired, worn down by time. It had been over a decade since I had visited, and while it was still vaguely familiar, the state of disrepair made it feel foreign. Grandpa greeted me at the door, and we headed out to the backyard where he fired up the grill. It felt a little awkward at first, but after a couple of beers, we began to open up more. I told him about my life, my fiancée, and my work, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We chatted for a while, but I know that's not what most people are here for. After all, this is a horror story, so I'll get to the point. Grandpa had worked in prison rehabilitation his entire career. He started as a guard when he was just 18 and eventually became the warden, a position he held until his retirement a few years ago. I asked him which prison he worked at, but he avoided answering the question. Must have been a tough job, huh? I asked casually, and he paused, considering the question before taking a swig from his beer. You get used to it, like anything, but it wouldn't be fair to call it easy. Always had to stay on your toes, expecting something to go wrong at any moment. You never really know what to expect, he explained. Grandpa went on to tell me a few stories from his long career in the prison system, though he seemed almost eager to share them, perhaps because he didn't have anyone else to talk to. He had always been a bit of a loner, and with my grandmother gone, I could sense that he had no one left to confide in. It made me feel a little bad for him. We continued eating and talking about his experiences working in corrections, about the mundane interactions with inmates and his colleagues. But something about his tone seemed off. There was a heaviness in his words, as if there was something deeper, darker that he was holding back. No doubt it was some government branch, but I never got any confirmation, Grandpa explained with a shrug. Grandpa continued, his voice lowering as if he was hesitant to speak more. He seemed to be reflecting on something buried deep in his past. They didn't tell me much about what was going on. All I knew was that these men, Smith and Johnson, they were part of something much bigger. They came in with all their fancy talk about research and clinical trials, but I could tell right away that whatever it wasn't right, Grandpa said, his tone growing heavier. He told me that the trials involved the prison's most violent and dangerous inmates. The men, Smith and Johnson, never made it clear what the purpose was, but their experiments were carried out under the guise of rehabilitation or reform. They often involved strange medical procedures, forced isolation, and psychological manipulation. Grandpa admitted he didn't fully understand what they were trying to achieve, but the consequences were always grim. Some of the inmates were never the same after these trials. They'd become unpredictable, erratic, or downright terrifying. Grandpa said that one particular inmate had been subjected to the experiments and had returned to his cell after weeks of isolation, a completely different person, quieter, more detached, but with an unsettling aura that made everyone around him uneasy. Another inmate who had gone through a similar procedure was found dead in his cell, though the cause of death was never officially confirmed. The warden and the two men were tight-lipped about the whole situation, and Grandpa, being the man he was, kept quiet for a long time, not wanting to stir up trouble. But it was impossible for him to ignore the strange occurrences and the unnerving changes in the inmates who underwent these so-called trials. Eventually, the experiment stopped, but not before they left behind more questions than answers. Never really knew what happened to those two men. They just vanished one day, Grandpa said, his voice trailing off. Maybe it's for the best that we never found out. By this point, it was clear that something far darker had taken place behind the prison's walls. Grandpa didn't want to delve too much deeper, as if the memories alone were enough to haunt him. But I could tell that these experiments, whatever they truly were, had left a lasting scar on him. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The atmosphere had shifted, no longer just a simple dinner between a grandson and his estranged grandfather, but a glimpse into the twisted and unsettling side of his past, one that, even now, seemed to disturb him. Eventually, Grandpa finished his beer, stood up, and went inside. I followed him into the house, the silence between us heavy with the unspoken understanding that what he had shared was just the tip of the iceberg. The stories he had told, the things he had witnessed, there were layers to it all that he wasn't ready to reveal. As I left that night, the sound of his voice still echoed in my mind. If there's a God out there, I can understand why we never hear from him. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered, what had really happened in that prison all those years ago? What had Grandpa seen, and what had he been a part of? Some questions, it seemed, were better left unanswered. Apparently, the two men, Smith and Johnson, had already made a deal with the warden, and Grandpa was to be a part of it. They explained that they were conducting an experiment to study the human mind under extreme stress. All Grandpa had to do was what he had been doing for the past 20 years, guard the cells and ensure there were no issues with the inmates. The deal promised a large financial bonus, nearly doubling Grandpa's salary for the year. But, of course, Grandpa knew there would be a catch. The things we do for money, he shook his head with a solemn look. These experiments would later be known unofficially as the Seclusion Project. The premise was simple: take 5 prisoners and isolate them in solitary confinement indefinitely. Smith and Johnson's team would monitor them and conduct their research. They explained that the study was meant to observe the psychological effects of prolonged isolation, but Grandpa could see through their words. It was cruel, it was inhumane, and by the end, it was a crime against human dignity. They knew that from the beginning, but they also knew no one would speak up for those they selected, Grandpa said, his tone darkening. 5 inmates were chosen for the experiment. The warden claimed they volunteered in exchange for reduced sentences, but Grandpa knew that wasn't the case. The 5 were some of the most notorious inmates in the prison. Prisoner 1 was a middle-aged man convicted of serious crimes against minors, serving a lengthy sentence. Prisoner 2 was an elderly man convicted of multiple murders over a span of years, and had been in the prison system for decades. Prisoner 3 was a man responsible for the violent deaths of an elderly couple and a child during a break-in, and he had been on death row for years. Prisoner 4 was a middle-aged man who had worked for a dangerous criminal organization, involved in multiple killings and other illegal activities. Prisoner 5 was the only inmate not originally from Grandpa's prison. He had been transferred from another facility, and Grandpa never managed to obtain his file. Grandpa described him as a young, thin man with long black hair and an unsettling presence. The cells for the experiment were placed in a secluded, underground section of the prison. The renovations took nearly a year, and once completed, they were unlike any other cells in the prison. They were soundproofed and completely dark. Cameras with advanced capabilities were installed to monitor the inmates around the clock. When the cells were finally ready, Grandpa and his team escorted the prisoners into their new environments. Most of them went quietly, but Grandpa suspected they were promised some form of sentence reduction, though this was never confirmed. Inmate 3 talked incessantly on the way to his cell, asking questions about various things, while inmate 5 remained silent, his long hair obscuring his face. At one point, Grandpa swore he heard a strange sound, a laugh that was both unsettling and childlike. When the doors shut, the experiment officially began. The lights in the block were turned off, and the heavy soundproof doors were sealed. The cells were far apart to prevent any communication between the inmates. From then on, the monitoring team would observe without intervention. Grandpa resumed his regular duties, checking in occasionally but never venturing into the cell block. The inmates had no contact with the outside world and were kept in complete darkness. They were fed through small slots in the walls, receiving high-quality meals unlike other prisoners. Grandpa expressed his discomfort with the whole situation from the start. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, worried I might upset him. Grandpa sighed deeply, his shoulders slumped. "It's hard to speak up for those you despise, even when you know they're being mistreated." There was a weight in his words, and I paused as he added quietly, "It's not an excuse, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Within a few days, the inmates began showing signs of distress. Inmate 2 began crying periodically, while inmate 3 exhibited extreme paranoia. The others remained mostly silent. Inmate 5 was the most disturbing, remaining motionless for long periods of time, with little more than sleep to break his stillness. Inmate 4 kept himself occupied with exercises, while inmate 1 mostly lay on the floor, slipping in and out of consciousness. On the night of day 5, inmate 2 suddenly slammed his head into the wall, blood spilling from his nose and mouth. He convulsed for a while before falling still. Grandpa expected a medical response, but none came. They continued to monitor him without intervening. Later that same day, inmate 3 screamed suddenly, blindly stumbling around his cell, banging into walls and mumbling incoherently. The isolation was clearly taking its toll on them. "There's something in here, man. Let me out." Inmate 3 screamed, his face flooded with tears as he shouted in desperation. He continued to thrash around for several more minutes before finally collapsing, gasping for breath, his eyes fixed on the ceiling of his cell. Grandpa believed, even though inmate 3 couldn't have known it, that he was staring directly into the camera feed. Meanwhile, inmate 1 began engaging in bizarre conversations with himself, alternating between speaking as though he were two different people. At first, the dialogue was nonsensical, even comical at times. But it soon took a darker turn. Inmate 1 started role-playing exchanges between a father and his young son, and what was said made Grandpa sick to his stomach. He refused to elaborate on the specifics, but considering inmate 1's crimes, Grandpa didn't need to guess what it was about. At some point, inmate 1 broke down into quiet sobs, curling up into the fetal position. Grandpa said that this was the moment he truly felt something for the inmates, and began to question what kind of man he had become for agreeing to such an experiment. These men did terrible things, there's no denying that. But after a while, you start to realize, everyone has a story. Were they born monsters or did they become them? I don't have all the answers, but one thing I do know, pain is a universal truth, Grandpa said, his voice heavy with reflection. From that point on, the inmates' mental states deteriorated rapidly. Screaming, sobbing, and incoherent outbursts became the norm, with the exception of inmate 5. Alone in his silent, pitch-black cell, the prisoners were left with nothing but their thoughts, and those thoughts weren't offering any comfort. Inmate 4 often mimed the act of holding a gun, reenacting shootouts and evasions, his breathing becoming labored as he acted out being under fire. Inmate 3, on the other hand, shuffled about, flinching randomly and collapsing as if struck by invisible blows. Inmate 2's condition continued to decline. The head injury he sustained had likely caused brain damage, and he would have violent seizures and screams of agony. He refused to eat, and his untouched meals began to pile up near the cell door. Some of the prison staff wanted to intervene medically, but Smith and Johnson wouldn't allow it. They were adamant, no matter what happened to the inmates, intervention was forbidden. By day 9, inmate 2 was dead. His lifeless body had been lying motionless for nearly an entire day before anyone confirmed it. As they reviewed the footage to determine the time of death, they noticed something strange. The moment inmate 2's chest stopped rising and falling, inmate 1 seemed to awaken from his stupor. He lifted his head, smiling and extending a hand, as though waving goodbye to an invisible friend. Of course, inmate 1 couldn't have known that inmate 2 had passed. It was a strange occurrence, but Smith and Johnson wrote it off as a coincidence. Afterward, inmate 1 descended further into madness, spending most of his time in a catatonic state. Inmates 3 and 4 also showed severe signs of paranoia and delusion. Inmate 4 would burst into screams, threatening someone unseen, only to collapse into hysterical sobbing, begging for release. At one point, he punched the wall with such force that his fist shattered into a gruesome mess. In contrast, inmate 5 remained eerily silent. He would sit motionless for hours, hiding his face, seemingly meditating. On rare occasions, he would lock eyes with the camera, despite the fact that he couldn't have seen it. Grandpa said he could still feel the chill from the way inmate 5 smiled at the lens, his demeanor exuding a dark, almost malevolent energy. "Let me ask you something," Grandpa interrupted suddenly, his voice softer, as he stared down at his boots, swirling his whiskey glass. His eyes then shifted toward me, almost as if hesitating to continue. "Is it evil to do evil things to evil people?" I mulled over the question, a shiver creeping down my spine as I realized where this conversation was headed. I wish I could offer some profound insight, but the truth was, I didn't have an answer. I simply shrugged and took a sip from my beer, and Grandpa's expression softened into something unreadable. "I fear the day the world finds an answer to that question," he murmured. Eventually, the team brought medical supplies to inmate 4. As soon as the guard slid open the access port at the bottom of the door, inmate 4 lunged toward it. "Let me out, man, please. You gotta let me out. I'll do anything." He desperately reached for the guard, but the guard managed to pull back, slamming his baton against inmate 4's hands until he withdrew. The guard then tossed the food tray and medical supplies into the cell, sliding the port shut. Inmate 4 began sobbing uncontrollably, alternating between pleading for release and making violent threats. His hysterical fits lasted for almost half an hour before he collapsed in exhaustion, but not before muttering something chilling. "Please, don't let it get me." That night, Grandpa was working late when one of the guards urgently called him to the monitor station. When he saw the feed, Grandpa couldn't believe his eyes. Inmate 4 was thrashing about in his cell, screaming as though something invisible was attacking him. By this point, the other guards were disturbed by the frequency of such bizarre events and wanted to intervene, but Grandpa overruled them. His chest felt heavy as he reluctantly watched the scene unfold. Inmate 4 continued to struggle, writhing on the floor as though being choked. His hands clawed at his throat, and his eyes bulged from their sockets as he gasped for air. Within a minute, he let out a final breath and fell still, lifeless on the cold floor. Once again, as soon as inmate 4 fell still, inmate 1 reacted, much like before. He smiled, then waved in the direction of inmate 4's cell, despite having no knowledge of where or who was in the other cells. It was as if he could feel the shift in the air, even though he couldn't possibly know what had happened. Then, inmate 5 did something strange. He slowly shifted from his fetal position, his neck arching backward, and his head lifting to face the ceiling. His expression was blank, emotionless. Then, in a whisper, he repeated the words that inmate 4 had spoken moments before. "Please don't let it get me." It wasn't just the repetition of the words that unnerved Grandpa, it was the chilling way inmate 5 spoke them, devoid of fear, but somehow still carrying a sinister weight. As he finished, his lips twisted into an almost unnatural smile. Grandpa described it as the sort of smile that could only belong to a truly deranged mind. Suddenly, inmate 5's eerie laugh filled the room, a sharp, manic sound that made the guards flinch. The laugh seemed to echo through the facility, growing louder and more frantic, until his eyes bulged from his sockets. It went on for a full minute, unnerving everyone in the observation room. When the laughter finally quieted, he whispered the same phrase again, "Please don't let it get me," before turning and locking eyes with the hidden camera in his cell. Grandpa would later say that he had never felt such pure malice emanating from another human being, as if he was staring into the depths of evil itself. That night, Grandpa had seen enough. He was about to leave when Smith caught up with him. Their conversation was casual at first, but then Smith asked a series of odd questions. "Have you seen anything strange here? How's your sleep been lately? Do you get a lot of inspections around here?" Grandpa didn't think much of it at the time, but he could sense something was off about Smith's line of questioning. It wasn't the type of casual conversation anyone would have on the job. The dread in Smith's voice was palpable, and Grandpa couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The next morning, Grandpa got a call from a frantic co-worker, urging him to come in immediately. He arrived to find the prison in a state of heightened tension. He was rushed to the camera room where he saw that inmate 5's cell was completely empty. The guards showed him the footage from the previous night. To Grandpa's horror, one moment inmate 5 was sitting still, and the next moment, he simply vanished. There was no glitch in the feed, no sign of movement. Just 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. Grandpa was at a loss for words. There was no explanation. One of the guards suggested checking the cell, but no one was eager to go in. After a few moments of confusion, Smith and Johnson arrived with the warden. Grandpa showed them the footage, and for the first time, he saw fear on Smith and Johnson's faces. "Lock the prison down now," Johnson ordered. The alarm blared through the facility as every inmate was ushered back to their cells. Grandpa and the others spent the next 12 hours searching the entire prison, but no trace of inmate 5 was found. The search extended beyond the prison walls, but still, there was no sign of him. Smith and Johnson then decided to check the seclusion block themselves. By the time they entered, only inmates 1 and 3 were still alive. Neither reacted as the men entered. Inmate 1 continued to rock back and forth, mumbling to himself, while inmate 3 appeared to be asleep. They searched the block for nearly an hour, but when they returned, their faces were grim. They didn't speak much. The exhaustion of the day's events had drained them. That night, Grandpa had the worst nightmares of his life. The images of inmate 5's disappearance haunted him, and sleep came only in brief, restless bouts. When he returned to work the next day, he noticed his co-workers looked just as weary, as if the weight of the previous day's events had aged them. They were all called into the meeting room with the warden, who informed them that the experiment had been officially discontinued. The only survivors, inmates 1 and 3, were to be returned to the general population. Grandpa protested, but his objections were overruled. The decision had been made. Inmate 3, having shown signs of extreme paranoia, quickly descended into violent behavior. He got into multiple altercations with other inmates, and during one fight, his head was slammed into a bed, resulting in a fatal cranial hemorrhage. Inmate 1, though more composed, was just as damaged. He withdrew from the other prisoners, refusing to eat and isolating himself. After a week of self-imposed starvation, he was found dead in his cell the following morning. The cause of death was undetermined by the coroner. The aftermath of the experiment was swift. The former warden resigned, and Grandpa was appointed the new warden. Many of the guards, unable to cope with the horrors they had witnessed, left the prison. For a while, there were concerns about a potential legal investigation, but no one ever came to speak about the events that transpired in the seclusion block. Smith and Johnson vanished without a trace, and over time, the incident was buried, forgotten by most. But for Grandpa, the memory would never fade. The horrors of that place never left him. Even as he became warden, the haunting memories lingered, and the question of whether those men were truly evil, or merely victims of something much darker, never truly left his mind. He finished his beer and placed his hands together, signaling the end of his tale. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, and Grandpa's earlier sternness had softened into a rare, melancholic expression. You know, we all make choices we're not proud of. We think we're doing what's best at the time. Sometimes we're wrong. I did it for the money, no denying that. But what about them, Smith and Johnson? What drove them to do it? His gray eyes shifted towards me, silently asking for an answer I didn't have. Did they ever find him? The prisoner who vanished. Grandpa slowly shook his head, his eyes sagging. As far as I know, he's never been seen again. I almost doubted him for a moment. His storytelling was so convincing that I almost believed it completely. Are you messing with me? I asked, but his face remained stone cold, his gaze unwavering. There was no need for words. His expression alone made it clear that his story was real, and it had clearly haunted him for years. How does something like that happen? How does someone just disappear into thin air? I asked, more in disbelief than curiosity. Grandpa rubbed the back of his neck, thought for a moment, then looked away with a half smile. If you figure it out, let me know. He chuckled softly and crossed his arms. There was a report, a few years back. A young woman was home alone one night when someone tried to break into her house. Terrified, she described the intruder, and the man she saw seemed to match inmate 5. His gaze locked with mine as I hung on every word. The cops searched the area but found nothing. Things calmed down. Then, about a month later, the same girl disappeared. No trace, no leads. It was never solved. Grandpa paused, adjusted his position, and scoffed as if shaking off the memory. Impossible, right? That's what I'd think if someone told me. But I was there. I saw it. He fell silent again, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing down on him. I waited patiently, unsure of what was coming next. Maybe it's better we don't know. But one detail from that case still sends chills down my spine. They found a message written in blood on her front door. He glanced at me, waiting for me to make the connection. That's when it hit me, and a cold shiver ran through me. Please don't let it get me, I whispered, and Grandpa nodded slowly, his face grim. For a while, we both sat in silence, the gravity of the story hanging between us. Then he spoke again. There's a saying I've heard. Hurt people hurt people. People who've suffered trauma end up passing it on to others. Maybe that's what these things we call demons really are. Trauma taking on a life of its own. He paused, giving me a moment to absorb his words. It was a chilling idea, and one I wasn't sure how to process. It's the best explanation I can come up with. But who knows? I've messed up enough in my life, maybe I'm just trying to make sense of it all. His voice cracked slightly, his eyes glazing over. For a brief moment, he seemed like he wanted to be vulnerable, but as always, he held back. Good talk, kid. Don't stay up too late. That was the last thing he said to me before walking off, and it would be the last conversation we ever had. His words stayed with me, lingering in my thoughts long after he left. I didn't know what to make of his story, but it was clear he believed every word of it. It disturbed me to think of his involvement in such dark events, but I couldn't say I was entirely shocked. There are all kinds of terrible experiments and trials in the world, I suppose. But that wasn't the purpose of his account. Grandpa was a complicated man with a complicated past. I didn't know him well, but I'm glad I got to know him just a little. It helped me understand why he was the way he was, and softened the sharp edges of his demeanor. I just hope he found peace before the end, but after hearing that story, I'm not sure he ever did. Grandpa passed away a few weeks after my grandmother. My aunt later told me that when they found him, he was in his favorite chair, a cup of coffee by his side, and a piece of paper on his lap. The note he'd written was simple, but its words haunted me. "Please don't let it get me.